These little stories of SIM are being done for B. Benke. They're solely her property, and she can share them or not as she wishes. Wait a minute. Uh-uh. Well, in the early days of the Institute, I was the first non-Italian to attend a Central Council meeting. Things were very different then. Everything was in Italian, and they were happy to have me because I represented the internationality of the Institute, and they wanted to achieve this, but they didn't know what to do with me. I always felt like Exhibit A under glass. One time they came to me and asked if I would like to have an egg for supper. I'd never seen anybody eat an egg for supper. In fact, I'd never seen them eat one for breakfast. And so I very politely said no. And I want you to know I was the only one in the dining room that night who didn't have an egg for supper. There are times when you can't make a nickel. At one of the General Assemblies, Aldo Micheli made a plea for an international, a non-Italian representative on the Central Council. Her plea went unheeded, and only Italians were elected to the council. She said then that she would use her prerogative as president of SIM and would appoint a non-Italian to the council. All of this was said in Italian, and I did not understand what she was saying until the priest from Canada said, "Stand up, Barbara, stand up." And then I knew that she had selected me to serve on the Central Council without a vote and without much voice, you can be sure of that. But it was a beginning way back in the very early days of the 50s. Now where's this? I learned Italian so that I could translate La Nostra Storia and find out something more about our heritage. At that time, there was nothing in English. I went to Berlitz, and I used to study on my lunch hour. In fact, the time came when I was rather proud of my Italian, and I went over to a council meeting feeling that now I could really participate. I did very well with the taxi driver coming in from the airport. In fact, we got along so well, he invited me to dinner. When I mentioned that to some members of the council, I thought I might be responsible for a few heart attacks, and from then on, they always met me at the airport. I never had another chance with the taxi driver. But I was trying to speak my very best Italian with the other members of the council. And then I always could understand better than I could speak, and I never got rid of my Brooklyn accent. But one time, at that very early meeting, I heard a member of the council say to Alda, "What language is she speaking?" You can imagine that sort of totally deflated me, and I almost forgot everything I ever knew. Alda at that time was trying to introduce some democratic principles into the council, and it was difficult because those women had not been brought up in that fashion. As some of you may know, if you are speaking in a familiar tone for the word you use the Italian word tu. Well, in the Berlitz that I studied, they only gave you the formal. And every time I would use the formal word, vostra, Alda would correct me and say, "No, tu." And my Italian was not good enough to tell her that I had only learned the other one. So every time I said it, she corrected me, and that's the way we went on during the entire council meeting. In 1970, after the visit to the Holy Land, Connie and I came back and stayed in Rome for a little while until the Central Council meeting. One day we went to St. Peter's to Mass, and when I came back from communion in the little tiny chapel dedicated to St. Pius X, I put my purse between my legs, and somebody took it. Everybody else in the chapel said it was a lady in a red dress, but nobody tried to stop her. So I went out, and I was really mad, and I went to the Vatican guard at the entrance to St. Peter's, and I told him my problem. Well, it was really a very good thing that I went there, although he said to me, "Lady, do you think everybody who comes to St. Peter's comes to pray?" And I wanted to say, "Depends on how you spell it," but I didn't think he'd get all that, so I kept quiet. But he took me to the Vatican police station, and there I filed a claim. This saved me a whole day of sitting in the Roman police station, which is not too efficient. But I had to get a passport, so I went to the American Embassy, and they gave me one that was good for just enough days to get me back to the States. And of course, I didn't have any money, but every missionary I knew in Rome gave me some money, so that by the time I had written down who gave what, it was really quite a chore. And then, just the day before I left Rome, Elizabeth Peter called me, and she said, "Did you have my telephone number in your purse?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure I did." Well, she said, some lady leading a Finnish tour called up and said that they had found the purse, and they were leaving that morning, but they would leave it at the desk at such and such a hotel. So down I went, and there was my purse. All the money was gone, of course, and my passport was torn into bits, but it was all there. So with my temporary passport and the money from everybody else, I was able to get home. Then when I went to get a real passport, I pulled a boo-boo, because I told the people at the State Department what had happened. But I spent a lot of time down there trying to assure them and writing down and swearing to my statement that the thing I did most often was not to tear up my passport. However, I did get a new one, and that was that. Where's the stop? Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what I'm doing right now, because it isn't working very well. So I am not sure, but I will do a couple of these and see what can happen. I'd like to tell you about Carmela Rossi and her dog. During several of Alda's terms as president, Carmela Rossi was one of her vice presidents. Carmela was rather a formidable person. She knew exactly how to do everything she was supposed to do, but it was not easy for her to be just relaxed and friendly. She was interesting. During World War II and the time of Mussolini, she was a very important person in women's Catholic action, but she was not able to openly profess her faith. Otherwise, Mussolini would have probably disbanded Women's Catholic Action, and he might have done a few very unpleasant things to her. So the only way she could make her renewal during his regime was in the confessional. He had no control over whatever went on in the confessional, and so she never made a retreat with the missionaries during that period. She always made her renewal within the confessional. She was a great dog lover, and she had some mammoth police dogs and German shepherds. Not all at one time, one at a time. One day at a time when I was there, she invited me over to lunch, which of course is dinner in Italy, and pranzo as they call it. Well, it just so happened that I wasn't feeling very well, and I really wasn't too sure how I was going to eat what was put in front of me, which was a half chicken in frozen jelly or jello. It looked wonderful, but it was just too much food, and I was sort of playing around with it when, most unexpectedly, the dog came to my assistance, got up, grabbed the chicken off my plate, and made off with it. I was never so pleased in all my life. She was so chagrined she didn't have an extra one, and I was so pleased I didn't have to try to eat it. Another time, Carmela invited me over for dinner, and this was really the first time she had ever invited me. And before we sat down to dinner, she poured me a small glass of whiskey. And she said, now I know from watching TV that everybody in the United States has a glass of whiskey before dinner, so I got some special for you. Well, with that introduction, I couldn't say, I don't like whiskey, I never drink it, and we don't have it before dinner. I drank it. And then what followed was a different wine with every course. It's the only time in my life that I really felt drunk, and I could hardly stagger out of her apartment. She didn't realize this, but I was so glad to get back to where I was staying, and I could go to bed and kind of sleep it off for a little while. It was my first attempt at getting drunk. And speaking of Carmela, I think I ought to say, too, that many of the missionaries of that era were very, very active in the resistance movements. You recall in a circular letter of last year, we had an insert about Katerina and how she had played a part in the resistance movement. Many others also did, and they did a great deal to keep Catholicism alive during the time of Mussolini. From reading the La Nostra Storia, you know that Armida Borelli and her mother had a summer home in Marzio, high up in the mountains, not too far from the Swiss border. During a very, very early visit to Italy, I was to be taken up to visit Marzio, which was exactly as it had been on the day that Armida Borelli died in 1953. 52. And Connie was with me at that time. We were picked up after Mass by a missionary who was going to drive us to Marzio. It was about a 2 to 2.5 hour drive at that time. Very beautiful scenery as you went high up into the mountains outside of the rather sticky city of Milano. The humidity in Milan is really terrible, and you're so glad to get up into the mountains. This girl was a pretty good driver, But when she started up, if you weren't prepared, you might have landed on the other side of the windshield. She had given Connie and me each a cup of coffee because we hadn't had any breakfast. And we were just about to drink some of this coffee when she started her little car, and we went forward with quite a burst of speed to the point where the coffee went all over everything that Connie and I had on, and we certainly didn't look like we were well-dressed Americans. In fact, we looked like we should have gone back to the university and changed our clothes, but of course we couldn't. And once again, I must say, the driver didn't even realize what had happened. Well, Marzio was a beautiful, beautiful place. What really was left of the house, as Armida had lived in it, was her own bedroom and the room that was the chapel. Her bed was just as she had left it. Her books, her little prayer cards, her Bible, everything was on the bookshelves and or on her little desk, and you really would have expected her to come back at any moment. It didn't look like a place that had belonged to someone who had not been around for a number of years. The little chapel was very plain, but very restful. In those first years following the death of Armida Borelli, she had left the Marzio to the missionaries, and they allowed missionaries to come up and for rest, R&R, vacation time, and so on. There were always missionaries there during the summer. Later on, one of the nearby groups, and I forget the name of it, took it over and really opened it as a place for the mentally retarded children and their parents, so that they could all come together and have a family vacation. It wouldn't cost them very much, and yet there was a great deal of peace and love apparent within this household. One of the things that I saw while I was there was the little church where Armida went to pray every day. And as you know, she always knelt in either the last pew or the second to the last pew. She never felt that she herself was worthy to go all the way up front. The priest of this little parish church was a member of the Priests Secular Institute, and it was very inspiring to speak with him. And then all of a sudden, he and several of the Italian missionaries began to sing "God Bless America," and that just seemed to me to be such a wonderful little thing. He could tell us all about the last days, 2 days, almost the last minutes of Armida's life, because he had been called when they came to realize that she was not going to make it through the night. As you know, Father Gemelli had come to visit her, and was on the day before, and he told her that that he would come back on the 15th of August and offer Mass, that if she was still alive, it would be Mass of the Blessed Virgin Mary. If she had not made it through the night, it would be the first Mass offered for the repose of her soul, and that, of course, was what it was. The foliage around the house, it was just beautiful. They had some trees, big, tall ones, that I had never seen before, monkey tail trees, and the branches did look exactly like monkey tails. That same time that Connie and I went up with this friend, we had no intention of staying overnight, but a terrific mountain storm came up, and I have never seen such lightning and listened to such thunder. Well, we couldn't get back, and of course we had no night clothes with us. We had not intended to stay overnight. Well, they went into somebody's bureau drawers and came out with two of the quaintest high-neck, long-sleeve nightgowns I have ever seen. We each put them on, and we didn't dare laugh, but we did really want to laugh. And we didn't have a camera, so we could never take a picture that we could eventually share with someone else. Oh no. A word about Father Antonelli. He had been Father Gemelli's assistant for a number of years. Many of the truly great friars in Italy were closely associated with Father Gemelli, and they were some of the greatest friars I have ever met. One was a very good friend of Nancy Fishelli. In fact, it was he who introduced Nancy to the Institute and told her that if she stayed in the United States, he would see that she came to meet Father Stephen and some of the missionaries. And that is how we had an opportunity to meet Nancy, and she eventually became a missionary. Some of the friars who were closely associated with Father Gemelli worked for the Opera della Regalità, the publishing house, or for the Vita e Pensiero, which was a very intellectual periodical that was published by Father Gemelli. Both of these at the University of the Sacred Heart in Milan. Eventually, friars went off to do something else, and we had a new group of friars with whom to become acquainted. When Father Gemelli died, he had made known that he wanted Father Antonelli to be his successor, and so he became his successor. Father Antonelli was really stationed in Rome. He was part of the congregation for liturgy and rites, although I think the name has now been changed. But he was also an astronomer. And one of the things that I always remember about him, he was a very calm man, very placid. He never got excited. And he said one time that when he had problems, he went out and looked at the stars, and he realized how tremendous they were and how far away they were. And here he was, just a little spot on this earth. And so that his problems seemed to take on proper proportions after he had looked up at the stars. And I thought that wasn't a bad way to approach things. Eventually, Father Antonelli was made a cardinal. When we got this news here in the United States, some of us thought that the USA, SIM, should really be represented. So Father Stephen and Stella and Ruth and Rita McLaughlin and myself, and I think Mickey, but I am not sure. I don't really remember that. We all got plane tickets and found ourselves a hotel, which was on the other side of Rome from where our offices and everything were. And incidentally, after the death of Father Gemelli, the offices were moved to Rome. This was a great step, really. The offices were moved from Milan to Rome, principally because Rome was then fast becoming the center of the Roman Catholic faith. And Milan was an industrial town, while we had very close ties to the university and to the Feminine Youth of Catholic Action. Because of Father Gemelli and Armida Borelli, it seemed that if we were to be in the mainstream of Catholic life, we had to move to Rome. It did cause consternation, but everybody eventually saw that it was the way to go, and that's what we did. We took over an entire floor of an apartment house, and eventually part of that
became the offices for the Italian zone. At the time that, in the early mid-60s when this took place, there was no Italian zone, of course, and it was all just one big leadership. But after the zones were created in 1970, the part of the office space there was given over to the zonal council and its activities, and it still remains so. We, when we got to our hotel, and now I'll go back to the installation of the new cardinals. But after we had arrived in Rome and we went to our hotel, I found there a letter saying that, well, I wasn't sure what it said. It said something about when we went to the Holy Father's Mass, I would receive communion from him. This was Paul VI. Well, nobody had told me anything about this, and I always travel as light as I can. So I came to realize that I didn't have a black dress, I didn't have long black gloves, and I really didn't have anything like a long mantilla to cover my head. So on the evening of the Mass, I wore the best I had, but it was not exactly what it should have been. And I didn't even know where to go. Finally, I asked one of the guards, and he took me over to sit me in this very, very special place. I was the only person there who wasn't all done up in black and looked just exactly like she was supposed to look. And I thought, well, this is another sign of my poverty. And I hated to say my ignorance, but I guess poverty and ignorance go pretty close together at times. When the time came to receive communion, I forgot all about the fact that I didn't have on the right clothes. And I did receive from Pope Paul VI. Incidentally, just at the moment that I received, the official photographer took a picture, and the next day I saw it in the window of the photographer's shop. So I went in and had one made, and I have the memory of having been dressed just like the uncouth American, and that was that. Another very interesting thing happened at the or during this visit to Rome. Um, a very good friend, priest friend of Ruth Gilman's, was studying in Rome, and we made arrangements to meet him one night for dinner. Ruth was living in Sioux City, Iowa at that time, and teaching there. So we did not compare wardrobes in any way until we got to until we got to Rome and saw what we were wearing. That night, I came downstairs and to meet the priest and Ruth, and we looked at each other and started to laugh. We had on identical dresses, and the priest laughed and said, "You know, I always knew you wore a habit."